I see some familiar faces out here, so I'm so excited to get to spend some time talking with y'all today. My name is Eli Ward. So I'm a nursing student and a religious studies student, and so I'm very much interested in where these worlds collide. Where does nursing, where does health interact with religion? And so right now I've borrowed a few minutes to come speak from our NCLEX review where we're getting ready for our nursing exam. And I brought this book with me because today we happen to pass the singular page in this entire book that talks about the religious persuasions of the patients that we're taking care of. And so I was happy that we at least got a page, but I'm sad that it's only a page. So for this thesis project, I spent time with individuals participating in a Christian recovery group. These were men and women that were in recovery for traumatic experiences in their lives, for addictions, or for other mental health issues. And they were approaching their healing through the lens of faith. And I sat down with them, got to hear some of their stories about healing, and then turned those stories into works of art that we'll maybe get to see. So this was my final project, and so this was considered to be a creative thesis project. Just a show of hands, who is still working on their thesis during this time? Anybody? Okay, awesome. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the process of what went into this thesis before I talk about some of the themes and ideas that were pulled out of this process. So this was considered a creative project, although I did ethnographic research that went into it. So if you're thinking a creative project will get you off the cuff and a little easier than a research project, you're lying to yourself. So good luck with that. This project really started 6 years ago when I had my first international experience in Guatemala, and I fell in love with the people and the culture there. I fell in love with this idea that humans are different and that can be beautiful. And so I spent a semester doing an independent study on the anthropology of Christianity and healing in Central and South America. And I thought that was where my research focus was going to be, and I was so wrong. It was not. But I realized that some of these universal ideas that anthropologists pulled out could be applicable in local communities as well. I've also had an opportunity to visit some forms of Christian artwork really around the world. And I've gotten to share some of those memories with some of you. So that's been Canada, Israel, around the United States, to get to see some of the ways that Christians use artwork to tell stories. And so I wanted to be sure that I was incorporating some Christian tradition into this project as well by telling Christian stories through artwork. As you can see, some of these are very loose, very free-flowing, very Protestant. Some of them are very organized, very orthodox, very technical, but they all tell stories in different visual ways. In terms of the actual ethnographic research that went into this project, I had to get IRB approval, which was horrible. Would not recommend, but oh well, we got it done. I had prepared to do my interviews and research. What is it like to actually be an anthropologist, to do ethnographic interviewing? How do I talk to human beings? That's scary. I bought a shirt, so I felt like I knew what I was doing. And I cleared out everything on my phone so I would have space to record some interviews, and actually finally got to work with my recovery ministry. And so I got to sit down with 5 individuals from a local recovery ministry and ask them about their stories of healing. What has healing looked like for them? What in their journeys of healing was impactful, was helpful, was difficult? How did they change through this process? How did they see other people changing through this process? This image is a t-shirt that was present at the recovery ministry as a decoration. And I love this t-shirt because it is another example of Christian art. But it's very different from some of the other forms of Christian art. And so this art is based in text, it's based in words as opposed to images. It's very bright, very colorful. And on this t-shirt was really spray painted some of the ailments, you could say, that these individuals were in recovery to try to find healing from. And I love that it was on a t-shirt, because a shirt is something you can take on and you can take off. And so I love the idea that these things don't have to define us. They're things that we can choose to set aside, choose to don new clothing. While doing these interviews, I also visited local churches to see what kind of stained glass existed in our local communities, as well as some Orthodox churches to look at some iconography and see how visual imagery was used in these spaces. So I did way too much research for this project, but I had a blast doing it. Absolute blast. I love this image on the far side here. This was a stained glass window from a church in Murfreesboro, and it featured an image of Jesus preaching to a crowd, and behind him was the Murfreesboro courthouse. And so I love this synergy of this biblical image with the very modern, very local image. And I felt that that gave me the permission to carry on with this project. I experimented with different mediums, dragged my glass patio table through the house to use as a light box. Got to work trying to figure out how can I create something that looks like stained glass but isn't stained glass, because I don't have the time or the money for that. I finally got to create my works of art, and each of the 5 windows that I created took about 28 hours of hands-on labor, starting with some planning and getting some sketches together, doing refined drawings, larger scale cartoons that stained glass artists used to build their windows on top of. I obviously wasn't using glass. I used a translucent piece of paper and a dimensional black paint to get the leading lines, filled that in with watercolor, and finally got to the end product. And as if that wasn't enough, I had to build a display to house these things in, so that we'll have a slide later. But these are the first 4 windows that I did. And so I created 5, and each one went with a different theme that emerged from my interviews with these individuals in recovery. And so the first one is about changing perceptions of personal identity. The second is about changing perceptions of family identity. The third is about how these individuals see healing, that they see healing as a slow, incremental process, and one that is deeply spiritual as well as physical. The fourth window captures some of the rituals that we would say these individuals participate in. And then the 5th window, I had to create a rose window, because if you're going to do stained glass, full send, right? And so this is the God window, which conveys some of the ways that these individuals came to understand God's identity through their own journeys of healing. And this one took me way too long, and I finished it the morning it went up. So that was an all-nighter right there. The actual gallery had to go up as well, which included planning, testing out 1,000,000 fabrics, and pretending like I knew what I was doing in Joann's. And then finally enlisting any friends and family who were willing to come help me set up this space. But I could not be happier with how it turned out. And so this was the display. It was up for about 2 weeks, and I had over 250 people come through the gallery to look at the art, and I was there as often as I could to share the stories of the individuals with you. That if you were curious about anything, I wanted you to know, what are the stories behind this? Somewhere in here, I also actually wrote the thesis. I don't know how that got done. And I'm so thankful for my faculty mentor, Dr. King, for putting in the time to read everything that I wrote more than once and help me revise. That was a process. I also defended the thesis and really had a good time with this project. And just like that, a 1.5 years of work is done. I'm standing in an empty room wondering, what in the world comes after this? I've invested so much time, so much effort and energy into this process. What could possibly come next? And I think maybe a better question to ask when we've done something large, or even something small, is who am I now? Maybe instead of focusing on what is the next task I have to complete, we could ask, who am I now? Who have I become through this process? So I'm going to walk through just a few of the windows, time permitting, and share just a few details. And hopefully this can add some encouragement to this awesome lecture series on mental health and the good life. Because these are individuals that are in recovery seeking mental well-being, physical well-being, and they're doing it through a lens of faith. So this is the first window that I created, which is the identity window. And so it captures this idea that perhaps in the past, these individuals thought of themselves in some very specific ways, often in very negative ways, very condescending ways. Ways that reflected a sense of guilt and a sense of shame for things that had happened to them or that they had done in their lives, but that through their journeys of recovery and healing, they were able to imagine their identities to be something totally new. They didn't have to be defined by those things. And so this central image on the window comes from the story of a man who I'll call Dan, and Dan was in recovery for alcoholism, and he told me this really emotional story of driving down the road one day at the complete end of himself. And he told me this story. He said that he pulled over his car and he knew that something had to change. And he prayed a meaningful prayer for the first time in his life, threw his bottle out the window, and he says that that was the day that he became saved and sober. And that was the day that his recovery began. And a part of that process, he said that the Holy Spirit sat down in that truck with me that day and wrapped his arms around me. And he said this quote that's at the bottom. During this process, Dan said, I looked at myself in the mirror, talking about the mirror of his truck, and God showed me what he saw, not what I had been seeing. And so for Dan, this was a moment in which he was able to see himself in a new way, to imagine that he could have a new future, a new identity, a new concept of self that wasn't attached to some of those things that had happened to him and some of those choices that he had made. The next window is the family window, which captures the idea that oftentimes we have to reimagine our families in the process of seeking mental well-being. So for these individuals, they'd often come from traumatic families, broken families, hurting families. They'd had loss, they'd had divorce, and they'd had trouble having children. And so for them structuring new kinds of families was an important part in achieving well-being and achieving healing. And so this central image here, I won't talk about the very central image, that's a longer story, but around the edge, I had some pomegranates that were labeled with some of the different ways that these individuals talked about family. And so some of these were the very traditional ways that we might understand family: fatherhood, motherhood, marriage. Some of them were a little more broad, talking about adoption and broader senses of community. And so for these individuals who oftentimes had very fragmented family units, they came to have a new family in their recovery ministry. And I hope that in college you've been able to forge your own communities that will stand next to you and provide strength to you when you need it, like when you're working on a thesis. This is the sanctification window, which captures some of these individuals' perceptions of healing as a slow, gradual process, as a process that is both physical and spiritual. This image here, I was talking to a woman who I will call Jessie, and I asked her to describe her journey of healing, and she used the biblical imagery of the Israelites moving out of slavery in Egypt and into the Promised Land. So if you're familiar with the biblical narrative, you know that they were promised to be brought into a land flowing with milk and honey, that it was going to be a good place, that there was a long 40-year process of wandering through the wilderness to get there. And when I asked her about this, she said, I'm not painting pictures of Egypt anymore. Meaning, I'm not dwelling on those things in the past. I'm not focused on where I've been and where I've been hurt and where I've let people down. Instead, I'm choosing to paint a new picture. I'm choosing to look to the future. And so I asked her, I said, okay, do you feel like you're in the Promised Land then? You're not in Egypt anymore? And she thought about that and then said, no, I don't think I'm in the Promised Land yet. But I am living off of the milk and the honey. And so she was able to make what I thought was a beautiful distinction between being in that place where she so desperately wants to be, but being in a place in which she's still thankful for the place that she is. And so this image kind of represents not being stuck in that in-between place, but existing in that in-between place. Being thankful for where I am, looking back at where I've been and choosing to push forward. And I think that that can be a helpful mental health tool, is learning to be thankful for where I am right now in this season of my life. Not ignoring the things that have happened to me or that I've done or the choices I've made, but choosing instead to orient myself toward the future, knowing that if I never get there, I'm thankful for where I am now and who I've become in this process. The word window highlights 3 practices that these individuals utilize on a regular basis, which include Bible reading, cataphatic prayer, and the sharing of testimony. And so all of these rituals involve language and the use of words. They're very regular as well. Bible reading and prayer for these individuals are daily rituals, whereas testimony might be a little more sporadic, maybe, that might just happen during conversation or during a formal setting. But I think that these were helpful examples of ways that these individuals found new daily practices to anchor their stability in. And so for individuals in recovery, oftentimes there are some very poor coping mechanisms that have been put in place. And so choosing to identify new healthy habits is very important to the journey of recovery. And so prayer, connection with the divine being who cares about you, who knows your needs and who can meet those needs. Testimony, the reimagining of your life story as something meaningful, as something purposeful, as something that can help someone else. And Bible reading, the intentional, focused effort of understanding something that can be difficult so that you gain the satisfaction of learning something new and of connecting with the divine source of wisdom. And then finally, the God window highlighted some of the ways that these individuals came to understand God in the recovery process. And so they shared with me that at one time God was distant, God was angry, God was far removed. But that now, as they've come to understand themselves and as they've come to understand God in this journey of healing, He's someone who cares for them. He's someone who wants to be close to them. He's someone who wants to see them well. And so this window highlights some of the different symbols that these individuals used when talking about God. And at the center was an image that also came from Dan, who I mentioned earlier. And he told me, he said, God is in the construction business. He's in the business of tearing down what's old and putting up new things. And He invites us to help redecorate the walls of our heart. And I thought that that was just such a stunning image. So I had to put Jesus in a hard hat, because what else do we do with an image like that? And so that central image recognizes what Dan recognized, that he's come to understand God as someone who's invested in his healing journey. That he's not someone who's distant and removed or upset, but someone who's excited to see all the new things that are coming, that he has a plan, and it's a good one. So, that was my thesis. one part in this larger, perhaps stained glass window, mosaic, whatever you want to call it, of a college experience. It was a big investment, but it's only one component. And I would hope to encourage you that your thesis is not the end of the world. It is but one component of this journey of college, but I hope that it can be a very impactful and very fruitful component of your journey. And so I'm so thankful that I've had the opportunity to come and share just a little bit about this project, to try and capture in 15 minutes what a year and a half of work was. And at this moment, I think if I have time, I'd be happy to answer any questions that you may have about this project specifically, or about the thesis process in general that I walked through. Yeah.
At what point specifically do you feel like you were committed to the idea that this was absolutely going to be your thesis?
Oh, good question. So I was not committed to this idea almost at all. And then I did that whole independent study, and I thought I'm going to do something about Central and South America. It's going to be great. And then I was in a class on mental health for nursing, and I wrote some papers in that class and realized I kind of really enjoyed thinking about mental health. And I wrote some papers in religious studies that included some of what I had learned about mental health, and in particular those in recovery. And my faculty mentor, Dr. King, was like, well, it sounds like you've got a topic. And I was like, I have no idea what you're talking about. She was like, recovery. And I was like, oh, okay, I guess so. All the puzzle pieces have come together, and she was able to recognize that for me, that would be an appropriate topic. And then I would like to say it was smooth sailing from there, but it was an uphill battle. But we did it. We got it done. So does that answer that question?
Yeah.
Awesome. Thank you. Any questions, comments, concerns, hopes, dreams, aspirations?
Or Natalie, take the stage.
All right.